Hi everyone, so GGG has released a balanced manifesto for patch 3.7 and I went through it last night, reading through it, and there is actually a lot of really interesting stuff, especially a lot of buffs to spellcasters and to bow builds and a few other things that are definitely pretty nice improvements. And I want to go through it a little bit, not read through the whole thing here because you can do that on your own if you like. It is actually a quite long post and it will already cover probably most of the patch notes that are relevant for next league. So there are also these spoilers here that have some of the specifics where especially like all the number changes are listed if you want to look at the details for whatever skill you might have in mind to play. In general, the direction seems to be pretty clear. They have nerfed some of those super crazy outliers, as you're gonna see further down below, like the Detonate Dead, for example. Bone Shatter is going with nerfed, and these kind of things. And also, for example, March of the Legion, which has become more and more popular after the mana reservation changes. And there's also other stuff from the tree, for example, that is new since the introduction of that item. Supreme Ego in particular, which is a very strong buff for March of the Legion. In case you don't know those boots, essentially those allow you to manually activate auras every so often and get that buff without actually reserving the mana. So you had like 4 extra auras, and obviously with a bit of aura effect on top of it, this was pretty nuts. They actually came out long ago and they were always like super cheap. I actually used them back then in my build and they were like a 10C item or something. And yeah, these days they have gained a lot of popularity. And I can say that, yeah, good riddance, because the juggling playstyle is quite annoying actually. Anyway, let's get started with those spells. So first of all, they made the damage higher in general, starting from basically level 2. So it starts out at exactly the same level in most cases, and then the growth is much more than before. So you can see this here, an example. So Absolution, now this 21 to 31, unchanged at level 1. Up to 870 to 1300 at level 20, which was 588 to 882. Now has 200% effectiveness damage instead of 130. So this is like pretty common across all the skills here. They didn't buff every single skill, so you can see that especially some older skills were buffed quite a lot here, and not really like the newest ones. Like for example, there's no Forbidden Rite or something like this that came out quite recently. But the overall picture is, yeah, around 30 to 50% buff for most of these here. And also similarly, these trigger effects, Arcanist Brand, Battle Mage's Cry, Traps, Mines, everything kind of got almost equivalent nerf. I think overall it will still turn out to be a slight buff, even if you use these effects here. So they definitely want you to use manual casts, which I believe is pretty cool, instead of all these mines and traps and stuff. They also nerfed Unleash, so this was actually one of my favorite support skills in the game, and this does quite a lot less damage now, so it goes to 41% less at level 20 instead of 21% less. So you lose quite a bit there, but Unleash was extremely powerful and it has gotten more tools to buff it over time from the tree. Then they buffed cast speed modifiers, so essentially across the board you can roll more cast speed on rings, amulets, weapons, so you can make more use of that. They also removed a lot of these threshold jewels that you gain as a quest reward, and like all these like little, so to say, required threshold jewels are basically gone now, and they are kind of baked into the base skill. And you can also see this in various places. So here's an example of the ground slam where that just has plus 10 to radius now instead of plus 6. I believe the threshold jewel gave it like extra radius, for example. Then you have the heavy strike with a chance to deal double damage. Then you have the heavy strike with a chance to deal double damage that starts at 20 and then goes up to 39. And you can see exactly this here. This is exactly what the threshold jewel does here, 20% chance to deal double damage. So essentially you get a free jewel on a lot of these builds, which is kind of nice. And here don't really rely on, you know, putting 1 or 2 of these into the build. I mean, here they had this limited to 2, so you could actually get it twice. But yeah, overall they were not really that crazy. They just had some special effect that you kind of needed to have for the skill. Some other interesting stuff. So for lightning casters, they want Orb of Storms to be more powerful, so you can kind of like set it up and then stand in the middle with your Orb of Storms and keep casting your lightning spells. So they buffed it heavily. And there's also some ignite compensation changes. So essentially they buffed those ignite producing skills. The explosive arrow, which now has 5% more damage with hits and ailments per explosive arrow on a target, I think this was actually removed quite recently with the Amons, and now it came back. So this also looks quite promising for an Ignite based build again, where you can do like some massive ignites. They also get some buffs to Explosive Concoction, some other stuff. So you can definitely do some fancy ignites now. And talking about those arrow builds, here are the bow attack changes. So in general, they buffed bows across the board, mostly through quivers and some mastery stuff. But basically what they did is they made this elemental damage to attack modifier on quivers, just increase damage with bow skills, so that now it also buffs physical and chaos builds. They did nerf Toxic Rain slightly by something like 20% or so to compensate. I think Toxic Rain is still gonna end up somewhere in a similar spot anyway, but everything else for bows has kind of moved up, and that is actually quite nice. So especially like the physical based bow builds that are kind of high investment, hard to build, or like some of the other attack bow builds. Yeah, they simply all got like a chunky buff. There are also higher values of flat damage now, higher accuracy you can roll on the quivers. They buffed quiver bases and remade some of them, so there's like more to choose from. There's like the arrow speed now, and there's, you know, just in general, yeah, it seems like a much better distribution here of quiver bases that you can use for different kinds of builds. So really, really cool stuff. And on top of this, they also buffed added damage for bows to give them the same values as two-handed melee weapons. So they're going to be much higher across the board as well. So then when you roll a rare bow, that they are simply much more worth, which is great because typically you have a lot of like really good budget, unique bows for bow builds, and going all the way to get like a really good rare bow was extremely costly, extremely difficult most of the time. And then you didn't really have much of an like intermediate choice. And now there seems to definitely happen more often, where you just can roll much higher flat damage on some of these weapons here. As you can see, in general, they have increased the flat damage added to weapons quite a lot. So 8% at the highest tier and more at the lower tiers, so that you can actually more reliably craft or find a good flat added damage weapon, instead of having these insane ranges between tiers. So this was definitely a problem, and it's good that they addressed this, I believe. It's gonna make leveling through the campaign kind of funny, I believe, especially when you have these super early game weapons and they also have much higher values. But I mean, this is not really much of a problem, and typically spell builds are definitely preferential for the campaign and even in early endgame. So this is definitely a very welcome change here. Similarly, they have also increased the added spell damage to weapons by up to 35% at the highest tier, with nothing on the lowest tier. So that's kind of reversed. So you start out kind of strong anyway, and then you can get even stronger over time with more investment. So typically this was kind of the thing on spell builds, that they kind of just worked because of their spell gem progression, and you didn't really have to invest as much into them. But now there's definitely more of a reason to get more of this flat added damage here to have a bigger benefit in the late game. There's also some other small things, like Hydrosphere got nerfed, so this was abused for especially bow builds, for example, where you just put a Hydrosphere on the boss and then you can have like some AoE, like lightning arrow, for example, hit both the Hydrosphere and the boss, so you double your DPS. They gave it like a cooldown of how often you can hit it now, so it's probably not really worth using very much anymore. So that's probably good. They made triggering marks much easier. In fact, they removed the mark on hit influence type rings, and they gave it a new support gem that you can just link with the mark and it will actually have the same effect. So that is actually really cool. And they also make it permanent, so that if you want to self-cast it, you can do so and not have to refresh it all the time. So this is a pretty massive buff to marks in general, especially for early game. And it also frees up essentially a ring slot, where typically they needed to have one of these influence rings. So there's more options for unique rings or some other rings that you might want to do. Some other changes to fortification. So there was a problem that you couldn't really get Fortify sometimes. So now it ignores the target's damage reduction. That is really nice. I also noticed this, that it's kind of hard to stack up fortification with the changes they had done, even for a melee build sometimes when it's kind of weak. So that's nice. Detonate Dead build got nerfed, but I can't really tell how much. So there is some changes about Spectre corpses and how that works. So this was a build that was very abused, especially this league. We can see some examples of that. And I actually expected more changes for Detonate Dead, but we'll have to see how this actually plays out. I'm not knowledgeable enough about this build to really understand the consequences of this, so we'll see. Seismic Trap obviously got a bit of a nerf. We don't know exactly how much, but they chose to nerf the area of effect scaling, so they have less overlapping explosions. And there is apparently still a bit of scaling where you can get more overlaps with more area of effect, but it was definitely too efficient. And Seismic Trap has been, played by pretty much everyone in this league. So it is nice to see a bit of a change there. And it sounds like they're not actually targeting the damage itself, and also not, for example, the charges. So they can still throw like 4 Seismic Traps on the boss. They're just gonna overlap the explosions a bit less and deal a bit less single target damage, but otherwise seems to be unchanged. So overall, I gotta say this nerf could have been much worse, and whatever the numbers will be, I think it's gonna be all right. Here's the Toxic Rain nerf, yeah, just a bit of a downgrade here on the flat damage, basically. So here are the unique items, and I already mentioned the March to the Legion. So instead of having 4 extra auras, it's only 1 now, but they also made an Blessing support skill gem now that can use without the boots, so that you can just have like an extra aura that you activate once in a while. So that sounds kind of interesting actually. So this can definitely be included in a lot of builds, especially builds that have quite a lot of mana already. And potentially you can do some stuff like removing mana costs, so you can actually activate this on builds that don't have a lot of mana, for example with Vaal Clarity, and there's also the Flask. So you can do some shenanigans with that probably, and kind of get an extra aura in your build by just pressing the button here and there. So kind of nice. Yeah, a few other things that go with that. And there's also some other like small changes here to other uniques. And there's also the Dancing Dervish. So with the removal of Prophecy, we're not gonna have faded uniques anymore. So probably some of them will just move to the core drop and the old one will be removed, I believe. We're gonna see the exact details very soon, I suppose, in the patch notes. But Dancing Dervish seems to be in a much better spot than before, because you can actually get Rampage on the boss. So you don't actually need to kill stuff to get a Rampage and get this whole thing going, so that you can actually play a Dancing Duo build more reliably, which sounds kind of nice. And finally, they also nerfed the Void Fletcher because they wanted to use rare quivers more. I believe this is probably not such a big issue anymore with the buff to the rare quivers, but they also want to review this, but I haven't given any details here. The problem with Void Fletcher is that it was extremely powerful, especially for very endgame builds, where you had a lot of extra plus arrows, because that kind of multiplies the value of that quiver, and it was not really that great in case you didn't have that. So I think this is also maybe something they could consider looking at here, instead of just the damage. But we'll see what happens exactly. But Void Fletcher essentially just came back a lot, especially for cold-based attack bow builds. So yeah, maybe it's not so bad to kind of see a bit more, like especially rare quiver variety there. And that already sums it up. So overall, it looks like no nerfs. In fact, Max has confirmed no nerfs to the defenses at least. So I expected, for example, armor to get some adjustments, or determination at least, or something like that, or even spell suppression. But nothing of that is happening, so it seems like we're just getting stronger, especially those spell builds, especially those bow builds, and this could definitely be quite interesting for the next league for a lot of builds. I think they're definitely moving in the right direction with some of the balance changes, so we go away from this trap dependency, for example with Seismic Trap, which has been very dominant, and we have much more options now. The exact builds that are going to be top tier remain to be seen, but I believe there's actually going to be a lot of variety this league. So overall, we're in a good spot, and there's going to be lots of fun stuff to play. I'll also be making some guides. I'll keep you guys updated with more PoE content, more PoE beginner guides as well. And I'm also going to be blasting the league, of course. So I hope you enjoyed my thoughts here. Let me know what you think, or if you have any cool stuff in mind you want to do next league already, or something like that. Hope you liked this video, and I'll see you guys next time.